Alright, so we've looked at a lot of different ways that we can do things in PHP, and let's look at how we can do comments and also how we can mix our PHP with HTML. Now we've already seen that we can output HTML with PHP, but we can also use it inside HTML. So you can see here we actually have some regular old HTML in here. Then we open the tag for PHP, run whatever we want to, and then we close it and we return back to an HTML page. And we can do that multiple times within the page if we want to, or we can just have one block, whichever works. But we always open and close our area that we want executed with PHP with these tags. So I could come in here, and if I want, the title to be dynamic, for instance, I might say PHP echo title, which I could have set earlier. And these are all going to be connected, if you will. What we set here is still available here, and it would still be available down here as well, even though we're opening and closing different PHP sections. So now the convention is to start it with the less than question mark PHP. Shorthand is that you can leave out the PHP part, and 90% of the time that's going to work. You do have some servers that expect the longhand PHP, so if you're building something that needs to be compatible across a number of different servers, then I would definitely go ahead and put it in the long form hand as it is here. But like I said, in most cases it'll work either way. Now let's say within here we want to remind ourselves down the road what something meant, and you can do comments a several different ways. I can use 2 forward slashes here and then put whatever I want to. This is a loop that loops through the food array. If I want to do multiple lines, I can do, like, let's say that I don't want to run this for each loop just right now. I can do it this way, and that it's forward slash and then the star symbol, and then reversed at the bottom to show that it's closed. Then after that I could echo out other stuff that I wanted to, say title or something like that, and that would work. And so you can do that to be able to comment out code if you're testing something, or to leave longer messages in for future reference. Let's also look at constants. We've talked about variables and how we can assign information to them. And a nice thing about variables is that they are variable. They can change over time. So for instance, we set title as document up here. Well, I could come down here and say title equals new document. And now when I echo it out down here, it's going to say new document. And up here, it's still going to say document, because it's going to process it in a linear fashion. And so we can do that. We can have a variable that we can modify, and that's going to be very important as time goes on, that we can modify these variables as our conditions change. But what happens if you want something that is going to be defined and you don't want it to change throughout the document? And we can use a constant for that. And so we use a built-in function called define. And we specify what we want our constant to be called. Now the convention is to use all caps on constants to make it a little bit easier to recognize them further on. So let's say that we want a constant with the name of title, and then we're going to assign the same value to it. We'll say document. Okay, so for now we can do something like title, and you'll notice it's not using any quotes, and it's not using a $sign in front of it, and that's how we refer to constants, just as simple as that. And so I can't define a title twice, or, I can't define a constant twice. Once it's in there, that's what it is for the rest of the execution of that particular PHP document. And so that means we can set, and this is used a lot for configuration variables and things like that. Instead of assigning to a variable, we can assign them to a constant and know that it's not going to change anywhere else. We can also check in our if statements. Go ahead and create one here. And we can check and see if a particular constant has been defined. And so we can say if defined title, then we can execute something. So that's just a conditional statement there. And then of course we can also use the exclamation point beforehand to say if it's not defined, then we do something specific. So that's just one way that you can test and see whether it's been set or not. So I could come in and say if it's not been defined in a previous file or previously, then I could come in and define it myself, knowing I'm not going to create any errors or whatnot. You could do something along that lines. The other thing I want to look at is functions. So let's say that we have something that we want to do multiple times, and we don't want to have to write the code for it all the time. And so we can actually create a block of code that we can reuse over and over, and that's a function. So we can give it a name. In this case, I'll say, and just as a simple example, let's say loop. Notice that I'm putting this around this block of code here. So at this point, that loop does not execute. And it's just going to sit there until we call it. So at this point, I can come in and say loop, and now it's going to do the same thing that it originally did. The difference being is that if in the future I wanted to call it again, then I could come down here and call it a second time, and I don't have to use the code. So it makes it at least a little bit reusable. The other nice thing is that I can use it for multiple purposes. In this case, we have a loop that only applies to one array. So what if I wanted to pass the particular array in? So in this case, I'll just name this array, and then I'll say, okay, whatever array was passed in, and this is what we call an argument, then whatever is passed in when that loop is executed, when that function is executed down here, it's going to use as our argument here. So as an example, now I would say loop food. And if I was to say, let's see, array, just for instance, now I could use that exact same code and loop through it as well, doing the exact same thing. So this is a way that we can use code without and be a little more abstract about it, make it useful for multiple purposes and things like that. So that's what a function is, and we can see that it's defined but not actually run when we call it up here, and then we actually call it elsewhere to get a value out of it. Now one thing that our function is doing, since we just grabbed this extra code, is it's echoing things out directly. And generally speaking, that's not considered to be a good practice. So generally what we'd want to do is assign this to a variable and then return that variable. And so let's take a look at how we could do that. So I'm going to create a variable called output, and we can define that up here. And I might say output equals blank. Then I can come down here and say output dot equals, and that's part of our ability to concatenate things. So I'm saying to append this to our variable, and then I do the same thing here. And so now, instead of echoing it directly out to the browser, it's going to keep adding those values as it loops through here. It's going to add whichever value is appropriate to the end of the output variable. So each time it loops, it adds a little bit more. And then, so once we're done at the end of the function, we come in and we say return output. And what that allows is that we can choose what we want to do with it. So I could come down here and say echo loop, and at that point it's going to echo the output, or I could assign that to another variable. So now test equals the entire string that we created as we were going through here. It contains that entire variable, which would allow us, if we need to do something else with that string before we output it, would allow us to do that. So using the return and not actually echoing anything out inside our functions allows us a little bit more flexibility to use this and reuse it as necessary. Another thing that loops are capable of is we said we could add arguments in here, and we can add multiple arguments in here. So we could say, okay, actually I'm going to expect various things in here. And then as we execute it, we would of course specify whatever particular variable that we wanted to use. One thing to remember is that these are order specific. So if I put them in here, then I have to remember, the exact order. Sometimes it's useful to use fewer and actually submit them as an array, which is actually what we're doing here. So I have multiple arguments and the order is less important. So either way, you've got multiple options that you can do, and either way is going to work.